All right, let's dive into one of the most chaotic and honestly fascinating periods of cultural change in modern history, the first half of the 20th century. We're going to see this whole thing through the eyes of a critic named A.C. Ward. His big idea? That in just a few decades, the way Western society thought about, well, everything was shaken right down to its foundations. And just to get a sense of the scale we're talking about here, check out this quote. This is Ward's central claim. He's not talking about a few small changes. He's saying that humanity went through more upheaval in 50 years than it had in maybe 50 generations before that. That's a staggering thought, and it's the premise we're going to unpack today. So here's the central paradox that Ward saw, and it's a big one. You had the scientific revolution, right? It gave us incredible progress, things we take for granted now. But at the exact same time, he argued, it led to this shocking moral and spiritual step backwards. It's like the very force that was building up our physical world was somehow tearing down our inner one. Now, to really understand why this change was so earth-shattering, we have to look at what came before it. We need to get a feel for the Victorian era, a time that really saw itself as a house built on solid, unshakable rock. So what was this Victorian mindset all about? Well, it was really defined by an attitude of acceptance. You accepted the way things were, you believed in authority with a capital A, the church, the state, the family, and you had this deep, firm belief that your world, your institutions were permanent. They weren't going anywhere. This quote just nails that feeling of absolute certainty. It wasn't just confidence, it was a belief in perpetuity. The idea that their way of life wasn't just one phase in history, but the final destination, an unshakable, eternal reality. But here's the twist. For the new thinkers coming up in the early 20th century, that rock-solid certainty didn't look like strength. It looked like a weakness. They saw it as a kind of borrowed belief system, a set of ideas people wore without any real personal thought, kind of like putting on someone else's old hand-me-down clothes. And that critique is what kicks off what Ward calls the Great Interrogation. This is the moment the intellectual earthquake really starts, and that solid rock of Victorian certainty just begins to crumble. And you can see the battle lines drawn so clearly here. You've got the old Victorian view, things are permanent, you should accept authority. And then bam, the 20th century view comes crashing in. Everything is always changing. You should question everything. And you should challenge authority. It was a complete 180 on how to see the world. One of the key voices leading this charge was the playwright George Bernard Shaw. Through characters like this one, he's basically asking, why are we so excited to throw out our old machines but so terrified to even look at our old ideas? It's such a powerful and, frankly, uncomfortable question to ask. And so this became the new mantra, right? These were the new watchwords being spread by thinkers like Shaw. Don't just accept something because you were told to. You, the individual, have to question it, examine it, and test it for yourself. But this wasn't just some abstract intellectual game. This quote really captures the human cost. For people who had built their entire lives on that rock of certainty, this great interrogation wasn't exciting. It was terrifying. It felt like the entire world was literally dissolving right under their feet. Now, this massive upheaval didn't just stay in the world of philosophy. It ripped right through the world of literature, too, creating this huge split. And if you were to ask Ward, he would point to one specific year, 1922. This is when James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land were published. And in his view, this is the moment literature stopped trying to talk to the average person and basically retreated into its own private intellectual fortress. And this really laid out two completely different paths for what art was supposed to be. On one side, you had writers like Shaw and H.G. Wells. Their motto was art for life's sake. They thought art should be a tool for changing society for everyone. But then you had the Bloomsbury Group, with people like Virginia Woolf. Their motto was art for art's sake. For them, the whole point of art was to explore the complicated inner world of the individual for a more specialized audience. Okay, so let's fast forward now past World War II. The Great Interrogation has kinda run its course, and society is trying to build something new, the welfare state. But, as you might guess, this new world came with its own bizarre set of paradoxes. You know, the promise of this new era was so simple and optimistic. The thinking was, if we can just give people economic security, jobs, a roof over their head, healthcare, then we'll finally have a happy, content society. All the old problems will just fade away.
But the reality that Ward saw was completely different. I mean, shocking, really. People had jobs, they had money, but instead of contentment, there was this mood of sullen discontent. Crime rates went up, not out of poverty, but maybe out of a kind of spiritual boredom. He saw what he called a cult of immaturity taking over. It was the ultimate paradox, a nation that was physically comfortable but was morally and mentally just frustrated.
So, after all that, what's the final verdict? What was the lasting consequence of this century of massive change, at least according to A.C. Ward? Well, for Ward, the end result was pretty clear. The big revolt against the old Victorian order, it worked. The old house, with all its problems, got torn down. But in the mad rush to destroy it, no one had any plans for what to build next. And what that left was just a spiritual vacuum. The old maps were gone, but no new compass was there to replace them. So without that compass, what's a person supposed to do? Well, for many, like the writer E.M. Forster, the answer was to retreat. He talks about this feeling of boredom, disgust, indignation against the herd, this deep conviction that the only way to find something meaningful was to get away from the masses, to find it in solitude. Which really brings us to the big question that hangs over all of this. The 20th century taught us to question everything, to doubt, to challenge. But Ward's analysis really forces us to ask, what happens when you succeed? If you tear down all the old answers, all the old structures, what are you actually left with? What is the true cost of that freedom?